current news podcast.
With Elu and Jesse.
Yes. Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah, great to be back.
Today, we're going really deep into a Justice Department report on the Lexington, Mississippi Police Department. You might be thinking a small-town police department. What's so interesting about that?
Right.
Well, buckle up, because this report reads like something out of a Dickens novel.
Really?
And it reveals some disturbing truths about the intersection of poverty, race, and law enforcement in America.
Yeah, it's a classic David and Goliath story, except instead of a slingshot, you have a team of civil rights lawyers.
Okay.
And Goliath is a system that often feels rigged against the most vulnerable.
Okay, so paint that picture for us.
Sure.
What exactly did this report uncover?
So imagine this.
Yeah.
A man gets arrested, jailed, and fined, not for some major offense, but for stealing a pack of sugar.
That's the reality the Justice Department found in Lexington, Mississippi.
Wait, stealing sugar?
Yeah.
That's the example they led with.
Yeah.
This is already heavier than I expected, and we're just getting started.
It's a powerful way to grab your attention, right?
Yeah.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. The report details a pattern of Lexington police targeting residents, especially black residents, for incredibly minor offenses.
Like what?
We're talking unpaid traffic tickets, loitering,
Really?
even things like having a broken taillight.
It sounds like they were going after easy targets, folks who might not have the resources to fight back.
Exactly. And what makes this case even more disturbing is that the police department's motivation seems to have been, at least in part, financial. The report states that over 25% of the Lexington Police Department's budget came directly from these fines and fees they were collecting.
Wow, 25%. That's a huge chunk of their budget. Talk about a conflict of interest.
Right.
It's like they were incentivized to criminalize poverty.
That's exactly the concern the Justice Department raised. This type of funding structure creates a dangerous incentive to prioritize revenue generation over public safety.
And that's where things get really sticky, right?
Yeah.
Because it creates this vicious cycle. You get fined for a minor offense, can't afford to pay, end up in jail, maybe lose your job, and then it becomes even harder to get back on your feet.
Precisely. The report refers to it as a modern-day debtor's prison, where people often already struggling make ends meet become trapped in a cycle of debt and incarceration for offenses that in many cases wouldn't even be considered criminal in other contexts.
Okay, so we've got the small-town police department operating like a Dickensian debt collection agency, targeting the most vulnerable residents. What I don't understand is, how is this even legal?
Well, that's where this pattern or practice investigation comes in. You see, the Justice Department has the authority to investigate local police departments when there's evidence of systemic constitutional violations.
Okay.
These investigations are designed to expose and address these broader patterns of misconduct.
So it's not just about one bad cop or even a handful of bad arrests. It's about a system that allows these types of abuses to flourish.
Exactly. And the findings in Lexington suggest this wasn't just a case of a few bad apples. The report alleges a systemic culture of disregard for the constitutional rights of residents, particularly black residents.
Wow.
And the financial incentives baked into their policing practices only exacerbated the problem.
So they were essentially balancing their budget on the backs of the poorest residents, most of whom were black.
That's the picture this report paints. And sadly, as we'll see when we dig deeper, the financial aspect is only one layer of this deeply troubling story.
I'm almost afraid to ask, but what else did the report find?
Well, in addition to the illegal jailing practices and the focus on generating revenue, the report also uncovered a deeply disturbing pattern of excessive force.
Okay.
And the story of the man arrested for stealing sugar.
Yeah.
That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, well, let's unpack that.
Right.
What can you tell us about this pattern of excessive force? So let's talk about this pattern of excessive force the report uncovered. This is where things get really heavy, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Certainly one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. The Justice Department found evidence of Lexington police officers using tasers, pepper spray,
Really?
and even physical force in situations where it was completely unnecessary and unjustified.
Wow.
And again, this was often directed at people accused of very minor offenses.
Okay, I need an example here. Help me understand how minor we're talking. What kind of offense could possibly lead to someone getting tasered or pepper sprayed in Lexington?
You ready for this?
Yeah.
The report describes an incident where a black man was pulled over for a broken taillight.
Okay.
During the traffic stop, he questioned the officer's instructions, and the officer responded by pepper spraying him in the face.
Oh my gosh.
This man ended up being arrested and charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct, even though the initial traffic violation was completely unrelated.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel, you know. Question a police officer, get a face full of pepper spray.
Yeah.
You mentioned this happening to Black residents in particular. Was there evidence that race played a factor in these excessive force incidents?
Well, it's impossible to ignore the racial dynamics at play here. While the report doesn't definitively say that every single incident was racially motivated,
Yeah.
the fact that Black residents were disproportionately targeted for these minor offenses and subsequently subjected to excessive force points to a deeply concerning pattern.
This is reminding me of that viral video from a few years back, the one with the woman being arrested for selling loose cigarettes on the sidewalk. It sparked outrage across the country.
Absolutely. That case in New York City really ignited a national conversation about police brutality and racial profiling. And what we're seeing in Lexington, although a much smaller town, echoes those same disturbing themes.
It's like those words everyone throws around: systemic racism, implicit bias. This report makes it real. You can see how these biases, conscious or unconscious, can infiltrate every level of law enforcement, right down to a routine traffic stop.
It's a stark reminder that these issues are not confined to big cities or sensational headlines. They exist everywhere, often hidden in plain sight within the very institutions tasked with protecting and serving our communities.
And what's heartbreaking is that for every incident that makes headlines, for every video that goes viral, there are countless others that happen in the shadows with no accountability whatsoever.
Exactly. The Justice Department report acknowledges as much. It states that many victims of excessive force in Lexington were reluctant to report the incidents for fear of retaliation, or simply because they felt like nothing would be done.
So we have this toxic mix of financial incentives driving over-policing, racial bias, influencing who gets targeted, and a culture of fear that prevents people from speaking out. It's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It's a perfect storm, really. And what's particularly tragic is that this kind of policing doesn't just harm individuals, it erodes trust in law enforcement, creates a climate of fear and resentment, and ultimately makes the community less safe for everyone.
Okay, so the Justice Department has blown the whistle on this deeply troubling situation in Lexington. The question is, what can they actually do about it? Can they force the police department to change its ways?
Well, they have some tools at their disposal, but it's a complicated process, and there are no easy answers. One option is a consent decree.
A consent decree. Explain that to us like we're back in civics class.
Okay, sure.
What is that and how does it work?
Essentially, a consent decree is a legally binding agreement between the Justice Department and the local government. It outlines a series of reforms that the police department must implement, things like revising use of force policies, providing anti-bias training, and establishing independent oversight mechanisms.
So it's like a court-ordered roadmap to get the police department back on track. But what's to stop them from just ignoring it once the spotlight fades?
That's always a risk, right?
Yeah.
But consent decrees usually involve federal oversight, which means the Justice Department keeps tabs on the police department's progress. And if they don't comply with the terms of the agreement, they could face further legal action.
Okay, so there are some potential avenues for accountability here. But what about the bigger picture? What does this case say about the state of policing in America, especially in small towns, where these issues might not always be on our radar?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This report on Lexington is a stark reminder that these issues are not limited to big cities or high-profile cases. They can exist anywhere, often hidden in plain sight, within communities that might not have the resources or the will to address them.
It's like we tend to focus on the big explosive cases of police misconduct, but those are often just the tip of the iceberg. This report suggests there's a whole hidden world of smaller injustices happening every day, and those can be just as damaging in the long run.
Precisely. And that's why this deep dive is so important, because it's not just about Lexington, Mississippi. It's about all the Lexingtons out there, the small towns and cities across America grappling with similar issues. And it's about recognizing the humanity of the people impacted by these systems. People like the man arrested for stealing sugar.
So where do we go from here? What are your final thoughts for our listener who's been on this deep dive with us and might be feeling overwhelmed or even a bit hopeless right now?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to kind of lose sight of that when you're looking at these, like you said, these huge systemic issues. It can feel very overwhelming.
It is a daunting question, no doubt.
Right.
But I think awareness is a crucial first step. The more we understand about these hidden injustices, the better equipped we are to challenge them. Reading this report, you might feel outraged. You might feel overwhelmed.
But try to channel those feelings into action.
Okay, so let's talk about action. What can our listeners sitting at home right now actually do to make a difference?
Well, knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Share what you've learned from this deep dive with your friends, family, and social networks. Start conversations about these issues in your own communities because, believe it or not, these systems can change. but it takes a collective effort to push for that change. So you're saying we shouldn't underestimate the power of simply talking about these issues, raising awareness, making sure these stories don't get swept under the rug?
Exactly. And beyond just talking about it, get involved locally. Attend city council meetings, contact your elected officials, support organizations working to reform the criminal justice system. These might seem like small steps, but they can have a ripple effect. It's like that old saying, think globally, act locally, right? So often we feel powerless in the face of these huge systemic problems. But you're saying there are concrete things we can do right here in our own backyards to start chipping away at the problem.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of demanding transparency and accountability from those in positions of power. If your local police department's budget relies heavily on fines and fees, ask why. Advocate for alternative funding models that don't incentivize over-policing and disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
That's a really good point. We often think of these issues as being solely about race or poverty, but there's a clear economic component as well. The way we fund our police departments can either exacerbate inequality or help mitigate it.
Precisely. And ultimately, that's what this deep dive is all about. It's about connecting the dots, understanding how these seemingly disparate issues, race, poverty, policing, funding, are all intertwined. And once we see those connections, we can start to envision a more just and equitable future for everyone.
This has been a heavy one, but incredibly important. It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and forget about these systemic injustices happening all around us. Thank you for taking the time to really unpack this report with us and for leaving our listener with a sense of hope and maybe even a to-do list.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Remember, change is a marathon, not a sprint, but every journey starts with a single step.
And on that note, we'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Turn the dial to the daily news. Turn the dial to the daily news. Turn the dial to the daily news. Bringing voices, headlines, and shoes. We turn the dial to the daily news.